is Daniel Walsh. I spent about 18 years at a large high-tech company. Held a variety of roles, did project management, was an engineering manager. More recently, though, as part of an internal consultancy inside of this large company. We're talking like 100,000 people. Our Agile community of practice was maybe 20,000 people. So very large organizations that we are working with, trying to transform them and make them more adaptive and efficient and agile. And so we were methodology junkies, as many of you here probably are, curating methods and practices, trying them out, seeing what worked and what didn't work. And so this is really an experience report, and I'm happy to share one of the more compelling methodologies. And although it's compelling, it was actually quite challenging. So this is very much a journeyman's report, halfway through my journey learning about this approach and how to adapt it and suit it to different situations. I'll tell you a little bit about sense making. I'll cover 2 mini case studies, if you will, to kind of give you a flavor for how this works. And really the end goal is to impart some of this knowledge and hopefully make you a little bit curious, a little more interested in perhaps exploring this concept further if you find it interesting. Sense making is a form of distributed ethnography. I think everyone here has probably heard of the ethnographic research, but you think about distributed ethnography, well, what is that? What does that mean? Well, typically ethnography is done by a small research team, right? They would go and sit in people's houses or study people's environments, do lots of observation. And here in this case, we refer to it as distributed ethnography because we're actually empowering the individual participants to participate in their own ethnographic research by the way this methodology is set up. And that'll make sense as we go through this talk. The purpose of this is trying to make sense of a very complex, messy situation with hundreds of people, hundreds of agents interacting in different ways so that you could take effective action in a very complex and dynamic environment. It draws on concepts from anthropology, cognitive science, complexity theory, and narrative, which is the metaphor of the storytelling doll, if you've seen figurines like that in the Native American tribes in the Southwest. And because it is based on narrative, a big part of this has to do with capturing stories from a large population. The way this methodology, this is coming from this gentleman here, David Snowden. There's lots of varieties of sense making. This is the approach, this is the person that helped train us, him and his partners at Cognitive Edge. And so he has this quote of try and get the system to describe itself, don't try and interpret it. What this is really saying, at least to me, is that as an ethnographic research team, it's easy to try and put our own lens, our own expert bias on top of a situation and figure out and diagnose what's going on. When in reality, what you really want to try and do is set up the system so that it could tell you what's wrong, or tell you what's happening, or tell you what's working or what's failing, as opposed to trying to interpret it yourself. Because in complex systems, one of the heuristics, if you will, is called disintermediation. So how do you put decision makers in touch with the on-the-ground realities of what's happening, as opposed to going through a bunch of layers of filtering and management and judgment to roll up these reports. It's really important to stay in touch with the on-the-ground realities if you have a complex situation. And so David Snowden taught us this approach, and it really begins, this is the one-page summary of the methodology. I'll walk you through this quickly, and then we'll go through a couple of case studies. So it begins with a framework, so you have some sort of objectives in mind, things you want to study. You ask people a kind of a prompt and a set of questions. The prompt is very open-ended. It could be something like, share a story about work that inspired you or gave you concern. So very open-ended type of questions that you're asking. People share short observations, or they could share kind of like water cooler conversation, or the chats you might have over lunch, just small banter, small talk, things like that. That's the stuff you're capturing. And then the distributed ethnography part kicks in, where you're actually having the participants that are sharing their observations and experiences tag and signify their own stories. So you don't have the research team tag and characterize the stories. You actually have the participants who know most about the situation add layers of meaning by answering questions. And these questions link this qualitative narrative to the quantitative world, which we're all familiar with. Kinds of correlations and stats and trends on this quantitative data now. So if you have hundreds or thousands even of stories, you could do all this quantitative analysis that you want, and you'll start to see emergent patterns and trends come up. So why is X correlated with Y? Why is this cluster of stories and narratives working really well over here, whereas this cluster over here is not working so well? So you start to see correlations, patterns, and trends. And then you go through this series of facilitated sense-making workshops where it's not the research team that's doing the sense making, it's actually a subset of the population trying to make sense of their own patterns and trends because they're swimming in the ocean. They're most familiar with the on-the-ground realities of what's happening. We share patterns and trends with them. Because those patterns and trends are actually tagged to the individual stories, you also have the narrative to give you plenty of context and situational awareness of why X is correlated with Y. And so that generates a tremendous amount of insight and learning, and you can develop interventions to try and make things better. How do we amplify the things that are working well? How do we dampen things that aren't working so well? And so you develop a series of safe-to-fail interventions. We don't know exactly what's going to work all the time in a complex system. So some of these things are expected to succeed. Many are expected to fail, and that's going to be okay. We need to make sure that's okay. And so as you deploy these safe-to-fail interventions, really the hope and the goal is that the stories that are coming into the system start to change and the patterns start to change over time, hopefully for the better. And that closes the loop on this overall feedback system. If you could have access to a huge database of, if you're capturing all the water cooler conversations at your company or the rumors and the chats that people were having over lunch or over a coffee, and you could have that huge database of stories self-signified by the participants that are sending in those stories, what questions would you ask it? A couple that we asked this database, if you will, are what are the lean and agile principles that are most correlated with business results? So does that sound like an interesting canonical question? Or how about, is it possible to measure the effects of middle managers that are resistant to change? We had a lean coffee chat this morning about the marshmallow layer of the organization, where it was squishy and fuzzy and things were getting lost kind of in the middle or mistranslated in the middle. The way we characterized it, or the metaphor we used at our company, was the permafrost layer. So it's this layer of middle management that's frozen or stuck. They have commitments they're trying to make to senior manager, and the senior managers are like, yes, let's go be agile, let's go be lean. And the front lines are like, let's go do agile, let's go do lean because it's awesome. And you have this middle layer that's just stuck because they have all the policies and the bureaucracy that they're trying to deal with, and they have pressures on them and they appear to resist change and they're stuck. And so that was another effect we'd like to try and measure with this approach. I'm going to walk you through these two mini case studies real quick and then share some of the lessons learned and open it for Q&A. It begins with sharing a specific observation. So it has to be something specific, something concrete, not like a list of bullets or anything, but like a real event or something that someone experienced. And again, it's a very null hypothesis, if you will. This particular example here is share a specific observation or experience that gives you hope or concern for the future of the company. We get stories in and we ask people to name the stories, and that naming itself starts to add layers of meaning on top of it. So this is a particular case study example of where someone is a coach is trying to get a team room for their employees, and they're going through all the bureaucratic process to submit proposals and ghostwrite emails for their manager to send to some of their admins to get the team room for their employees. And it's just a long slog through the bureaucratic process to get things to happen, to co-locate your team for a period of time while you're trying to kick off a new project or do Kanban or something like that. And so the story would come in, and then you ask the person a series of questions. So here's a couple of sample questions. So what's the overall effect on business based on what you shared? And so this person might signify it towards a negative, since this is a negative business effect story about bureaucracy. And there's other questions about, which attributes are present and needed or lacking and needed based on what you shared. And these attributes are some lean and agile principles, kind of a mix mash. So you'd see things like learning and trust and transparency and things like that. So now you have a story, a narrative, qualitative data that's tagged with this metadata. And with this very simple 3-question approach, you can actually generate some pretty interesting patterns. Which of these principles do you think are most correlated with business results, if you had to guess? Just think about that for yourself for a second. That was one of the canonical questions we wanted to ask. And what we found was this. So this is based on about 200 stories. It's not meant to be a statistically valid sample. It's just kind of a convenient sample. We'll talk about that a bit later. And the way you read this is according to participants that sent in the stories were respect for individuals, learning, and trust were almost always read negative business results. Whereas the things here along the bottom, customer value, humility, that's kind of more of a mix in red and green effects on business. So basically you can make claims or say statements like this. Stories where respect for individuals was lacking and needed tended to have negative effects on business, which is kind of an interesting idea. And then if you want to understand why, of course you have access to the stories to actually dig into the details and understand the context. So at least in this small mini case study, respect for individuals was a very important principle that we need to go off and understand because it was so correlated with business results. All right, so here's another example of another question type called a triad, and this is one of a bit of a training triad before we get into the nitty-gritty details of what this looks like. Imagine you're sharing a story and we're asking you to position a marker somewhere within the triangle that best fits the situation. So I'm giving a talk right now, right? Some of the canonical concepts, if you will, for delivering a presentation. Is the content good? Is the delivery good? And is the environment good? These are all good things. There's no obvious right or wrong answer. It's not like a traditional Likert scale on a scale of 0 to 10. This is how you feel, 10 being awesome and amazing. That's always the right answer. Because things are balanced in this particular triad, there's no obvious right or wrong answer. It helps to make it a little bit more novel, a little more interesting, and not as easy, if you will, to game because there is no right answer. I'm not asking you for a 10. I'm just asking you to tell me how things were for you in this presentation. And so if I surveyed all of you, we'd actually get maybe 60 data points, 70 data points. And if this pattern emerged from this trend, what would this tell you? So maybe this tells me that I need to work a little bit more on my delivery, or being more engaging to the audience, or do some more hands-on workshops or whatnot. So you could get some interesting patterns from these types of ambiguous frameworks. Here's another framework that we used to focus on the permafrost layer problem that we were having at our company. And so we were asking people about attitudes towards change. And so the three options here are, in the story that you just shared, the attitude towards change was keep as is, it was thoughtful, and it was enthusiastic. And now I'm splitting the data, about 200 stories or so, between the green positive stories and the red, the negative effect on business stories. And you can already see a pattern or trend across this. So that's one pattern that emerged from this particular question on exploring the attitude towards change. Now we're going to combine that with another question which has to do with alignment. Based on the story you shared, do you support the story or do you oppose the story? And then what do you think your manager would say? Does your manager support it or oppose it? And that's kind of a bit of an evaluation on the employee's part or whoever's submitting the story. Really what we're looking for here is, are you on the same page with your manager? So if you share a positive story, hopefully your manager would support it. If you're sharing a negative story, hopefully your manager would be on the same page with you and oppose it. This is what misalignment looks like, and this is what alignment looks like. Now we could cross that with the last triad and get some interesting, you could start to slice and dice this data. This is where the quantitative stuff kicks in. You could cut this any number of ways. So this is one way that we tried to measure the permafrost problem at our company. So on the y-axis, this is based on that triad. The attitude towards change was keep as is versus thoughtful, enthusiastic. And this is, are you on the same page with your manager? And you can already see kind of this problem where you have this cluster of stories where you're not on the same page as your manager, and the attitude towards change is keep as is. Whereas up here in the upper right, you are on the same page as your manager and an enthusiastic or thoughtful approach towards change. And then obviously the color coding is based on the business results as signified by the participant. So yeah, go ahead. Each bubble is a story. That's right. So all these stories are individuals sending in things and signifying their own experiences.
What's the difference between the sizes?
We asked another question that was, how common is this situation? Is it very common or is it rare? And you could ask obviously different questions as well. Another one of our favorites was, how long will you remember this situation, this event? Are you going to remember it for all time, like you'll take it to your grave, or you'll remember it for a day or two? So we're trying to, I guess, give a little bit of color to represent how common this is or how impactful it was to an individual. Now, if you have this as an ongoing effort, you could start to actually use this to measure progress over time. So if you add up the ratio, or you say there's 20 stories down here, there's 80 stories up there, it's kind of a 1-to-4 ratio between good and bad. So what can the management team or the change agents in the organization do to affect change? And instead of having an 80-20 split, hopefully after they deploy several safe-to-fail interventions, maybe it's 85-15 or 90-10. So it's a way of measuring progress over time. Like, are the stories in your organization getting better, or are they getting worse, according to the objectives that you're going after? Go ahead.
Question on one of the earlier slides where you were showing the different you be answering those questions for each user story that's being recorded?
Yes. So the question is, when people are answering this table here, at the same time that they're submitting the story, they're saying, my story was lacking this. My story had that present. So it's at the exact same time that you're typing in the story or dictating the story, whatever, you're having the participants share how they felt about it and add these layers of meaning. And it's not the research team, it's the person submitting the story. And that's the point I want to make very clear. Go ahead.
The items that you have here that are being considered respect for individuals, boundary humility, are those pretty standard that you're saying are the ones that we should be making?
No. So these were the principles, a collection of lean and agile principles that our team chose to look at. So you could look at the principles in the Scrum guide if you're doing a more maybe intact analysis on Scrum. So it depends on what your research objectives are, what concepts and principles you would ask. So that was part of the heavy lift in the learning in terms of learning how to do this approach is what questions do you ask, how do you ask them? Because the more questions you ask, the more problematic that becomes in terms of length and cognitive overload. If you have these two questions, you could generate a permafrost metric, if you will, to try and get as a measure of progress over time. And really what you're asking in the interventions then is, how do we get more stories like these and fewer stories like those? What can we do to propagate, to amplify these types of events? And obviously you could read each of those stories, and so you know what you're looking for. So you're coming up with these safe to fail interventions to try and get more like the green and less like the red. These are a summary of our lessons learned, and then I'll turn it over for questions. In terms of results, some of the things we observed is that it's really easy for senior managers and leaders that get hit all the time with these charts and graphs with organizational health and how are things doing, and it's typically a bunch of numbers and maybe some cherry-picked snippets of text or something like that. So when you hand a senior manager a list of like 3 to 5 really good stories and 3 to 5 bad stories and 3 to 5 really ugly stories from their organization, it's really, really difficult for those leaders to kind of dismiss it, because this is the on-the-ground reality of what's happening in their organization. So we found that the narrative component of the data was actually very compelling and hard for leaders to ignore. So for example, we had one VP basically say, well, that employee, I know what happened, I was there, I experienced that with that employee. I don't know exactly who it was, but I know what they're talking about. And the way they talked about that story, they don't really understand the whole situation. There's a bunch of other things going on, and that was just that one kind of rogue employee. But then he kind of paused and stepped back and said, well, but that is a real perception, right? There's something broken in the communication structure of the leadership chain that employee felt so frustrated or victimized or whatever that they didn't maybe understand the whole context. So maybe it's more of a communication problem. That's how he internalized it. We need to do a better job of communicating the whole story of what's happening and why we're causing pain to employees. We did find it as a pretty effective tool for detecting troubling weak signals. So we did another survey where we were looking at diversity and inclusion and how do we retain diverse talent at our company. Collected about 1,000 stories. One of the questions that we asked was, how do you feel about the story? We had about 8 to 10 feelings associated with the stories. And I tossed in a pretty strong feeling called fear. So if an employee sends in a story and they tag it as it made them feel fearful, that's, even though it's a small population, maybe 3-5% what we saw, but that's a troubling weak signal that an employee would actually send in a story and they would tag it as it made them afraid or fearful. That's troubling. So we thought it was a pretty compelling way to detect troubling weak signals. And I think it is probably one of the better approaches that I've come across in terms of how you can measure progress in a complex adaptive system with lots of people without actually knowing what success looks like in the future. So we don't really know what's going to work, what's going to make things better, what's going to make things fail, or maybe there's some new reorg coming up or some new merger or a division's getting shut down or whatnot. So we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but it is a good way, I think, of measuring progress. Are the stories of your organization getting better over time, I think is really what we learned. Now, in terms of methodology challenges, this is not for the faint of heart. There is quite a bit of learning that goes into this, even beginning with framework design. So what questions do you ask? Initially, we had like 8 triads in our first thing, and that was just way too much for people. It'd take them maybe 10 minutes to signify a simple story. So there's a balance between how many questions you ask and the way that you ask them so that you don't bias participants. So there's a whole learning curve associated with how you design the framework. Many large companies, ours had survey fatigue. How do you position this as not just another survey? Because that's how typically employees would look at it. So making sure to not and call out the distinctions for why this is different than a traditional survey. It actually is quite different. And then there's obviously going to be some iteration needed. So do some pilots, collect some data with 20 people. If that's working, great, go big. A lot of times some indications of failure where if a bunch of people, almost all these questions would have like an NA option, like not applicable or does not apply. So if you got 100 stories and 50% of the people said this triad doesn't apply or this question doesn't apply, then it's probably not a good question. We're really shooting for like 70, 80, 90% applicability for your questions that you're asking. From a collection perspective, this is another big challenge. Getting people to take 10 minutes to submit a story is actually asking a lot. So we did a lot of like mass marketing approaches. We set up booths in the cafe and things like that, and almost nothing worked. And the mass marketing, we tried that probably like 5 or 6 times in different ways. All right, we sent it from the coaching community, that didn't work. We sent it out from the admins, and that didn't work. We sent it out, had a VP send it out, and that didn't work. Anyway, you get the idea. The mass marketing just didn't work pretty much every time that we tried it. The one thing that we did work is essentially trying to make it part of someone's job. So we would randomly select a group of employees in the organization. We said, okay, for the next 2 weeks, your job, you're going to be kind of the chief storytelling champion for your organization. And we'd like you to submit a story every day about just things you'd observe based on the prompts and the questions. And so when you make it part of someone's job, we found that to be much more effective, especially if that person knew kind of the overarching mission and purpose for what we're trying to achieve with this project. So that's really probably the better way of going about this, is to have storytelling champions or trying to integrate it with a work process. For example, every time you do a retrospective, have everyone on the team contribute a story. That's another example of integrating this with some sort of a work process. From an analysis perspective, I think you do need to be a little bit careful. All these were random. These were not a random sampling for the most part. This was more of people that came across it would submit stories. So we kind of call this more of a convenient sampling, that the people that were conveniently available submitted stories. So you need to be a little bit careful about the statistical claims that you're making about whatever results that you find. And so rather than making a statistical claim saying, 80% of the population felt like this, really what you're trying to say is, do we have enough evidence? Do we have enough stories to take action? You're not trying to say 80% of the population felt this way. You're just trying to say, do you see enough in front of you at this, in this data to warrant some sort of intervention or some sort of action?
Can you just clarify? I thought this was where you're creating, you have your user stories, and then you kind of just you're ranking on when you've got that criteria that you're judging about them. But I think you're saying you're creating user stories just like this. I guess that's what.
No. So I do want to actually separate this from the Agile user stories from, think of like water cooler conversations. Like, what were the stories that you shared over lunch today or over a coffee? That's what we mean by narratives or stories. Now, we have used this before as part of an innovation project. We sent this out, this is for a nonprofit, where you're collecting people in the field that were doing water quality monitoring. They were monitoring like rivers and bays and estuaries. And so we were collecting stories from them for what was working or not working in their process of monitoring the water quality of whatever body of water they were monitoring. And so and that's a little bit closer to a user story in the sense that you have a couple thousand people submitting stories about troubles that they're having with technology, or it's not usable, or something's going wrong with how they're implementing this water quality job that they're trying to do. And that particular data set turned into a pool of data that a design team then could go use and mine as inspiration for new features, new products, new innovations. That is more closely aligned with user experiences, if you will, that you're capturing and signifying. And then the last one here is on interventions and feedback. I do think continuous capture is probably the preferred approach for over kind of a one-time pulse. We ran this, different versions of this, maybe 6, 8 times at our company, mostly as one-time pulses. And without having someone, almost like a population, a team of inspired individuals, a group of managers willing to, I guess, develop and create and deploy interventions, this just kind of turns into kind of an interesting research report. Oh, that's interesting that you have these patterns and trends. Fantastic. Really what you want is have some team of people affect change and do something about that over time. And having sponsorship and management bought into the fact that when we get this data, we're going to act on it is a key part of this process as well. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Q&A. We've got about time for one or two questions.